Good morning. I hope everybody's doing well today. It's hard not to do well with the weather like it is, isn't it? Amen. Gorgeous outside. Gorgeous inside too. Back in 1964, I remember it well. There was a song that came out on the radio called Silence is Golden. Do you remember that? Silence is Golden. It was recorded by the Four Seasons in 64, but it was on the B-side of a 45, if that means anything to you. In 1967, the Tremolos recorded it, and it made a hit. Everybody's done it since then. But Silence is Golden is a phrase that we know and repeat and a lot, I guess, in these days. But it wasn't the original phrase. The original phrase was written in German by a Swedish man. It was back in the 1800s. And it said, silence is golden. No, that's not what it says. It says, silver. I didn't write it down, so you'll have to speech is silver, silence is golden. That's what it says. Speech is silver, but silence is golden. But I want you to know that silence is not golden always. Silence is gold, all right. The original phrase that was coined puts silence ahead of speech. Sometimes that's true. Most of the time that's true. We're better off if we keep silent than to speak a lot of words. And the Proverbs say that. But also the Bible says that there are times that you can speak. There are times when you need to speak. And to be silent is really not helpful. And silence is golden, but not always. So today we're thinking about that theme as we go through the story of Esther. Esther's got 10 chapters in it. And you know how foolish it is for me to try to cover 10 chapters in one lesson. So we're not going to cover the whole story of Esther. We're going to cover some people, though. And part of the message that I think is at the crux of Esther's story or her message. Silence is golden, but not always. In Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, it says, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. That's also known as Sushan in some translations. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. Xerxes is the way it's recorded in my Bible, the NIV, but that's his Persian name. And remember that neither Persia or Babylonia were Hebrew, but the Hebrew word is Ahasuerus. And I can say Xerxes better than Ahasuerus, so we're going with Xerxes. Here, King Xerxes threw a huge party. It lasted for 7 days, and it was after 180 days of his showing off all his wares and everything that he had, and that was open to the public. So you can imagine the party went on for 180 days. That's a pretty long party. But then he had a special banquet for all the nobles and all the province governors and everybody that was present. He invited in, and there were 7 days. They had a food buffet that was continuous, and they had a bar that was continuous as well. You can imagine what the scene was like. And they evidently took advantage of the bar a lot. So when the king was full of his spirits, I suppose, he called for his wife, Queen Vashti. And he said, I want you to come in. I want you to show yourself off to all the men that are here. Queen Vashti sent word back, no, I'm not coming. And that, I'm sure, set the king back a little ways because he was selfish and self-centered and wicked and immoral. That was just his leadership style. He owned a lot of stuff. And for his wife not to show up was kind of an insult to him. So Xerxes called for his wife, and she said no. One translation says, incidentally, that she was to come wearing just her crown. The other translations say, be sure you wear your crown. This one says, wearing just your crown. And I'm assuming that that's just as possible because Xerxes was, an ungodly person. And she was very beautiful, the Bible says. And so, when she wouldn't come, he sought his advisors and asked them all what they needed to do with her. Well, then Memucan, you can tell his advice is not going to be good by his name, Memucan. Then Memucan gave this advice. This is verses 16 and Esther chapter 1. Then Memucan replied, in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. He's blowing it a little out of proportion, I think. But that's the advice, the official advice that he gives. So, the first lesson, I suppose you could say, would be don't be easily influenced by the opinion of other people, particularly this kind of other person. He called all of his advisors in. He asked them what to do about Vashti. That's a personal matter between a man and his wife to begin with. They didn't have the same customs that we have, and they didn't have the same instruction that we have. And so he asked everybody. He asked all his wise men and sorcerers. And Memucan is the one that spoke up. He gave his advice for everybody to hear. That's not a good idea either. If you're going to seek advice, you want to do it privately. Seek advice. It should have been private, kept private, but it was in the presence of the king and his nobles. And they didn't ask any questions or check the situation out. They didn't talk to Vashti. They didn't get her side of the coin. They just presented this from his point of view, from their selfish point of view. And so it's not godly advice. And without, saying, he didn't ask God at all, anything about it. So you can imagine the advice is not godly advice. Well, we know that we're supposed to ask advice, we're supposed to seek advice. The Proverbs are full of that instruction for us. We don't know, all the situation or everything that we should know sometimes. You need to talk to other people. You need to talk to people that are well-versed, that have overcome some things in their lives. The people that are older than you is probably a good place to start. And get, 2 or 3 sources of advice. And he didn't do any of that. He took the advice of Memucan based on that principle of selfish desires. And he was a follower instead of a leader. He was a leader probably in military might. But you can read through this story, and there are several occasions where he takes the advice of people that's not good. And he gives up his throne in a lot of ways. And who should look after you more than your own spouse? I mean, that should be our spouses should be treasured by us. And we should protect them at all costs. And if we have difficulties, or when we have difficulties, you deal with that on a one-on-one basis. You don't broadcast, and you don't seek advice from anybody and everybody. And, I've got some other things, that I would like to say on that subject, but we'll move ahead for today. Well, Vashti is the next person, and she is illustrating the concept that we need to stand up for morality, even at personal cost. Stand up for morality. And there's no indication that Vashti was a godly person. But when Xerxes wanted her to come into the room full of drunks, she wouldn't agree to come. And that was a stand. It was a stand on principle, if nothing else. A stand on morality, if nothing else. In Esther chapter 1, verse 10, it says, on the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Memucan, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. No matter what, she wasn't going to have anything to do with it. And saying no wasn't an easy thing to do either. If you can think about Vashti, she had at her access anything and everything she wanted. In life, anything she wanted, she could have. But her morality is something personal. And she wasn't willing to compromise that. It never is easy to say no. Sometimes we're called on for moral reasons or whatever to violate our consciences that way. The world is full of women who have babies and they're not married to the men they have babies from. But that's a problem for women, but it's a problem for the men too. Because wherever that happens, you can be sure that a man is there. And, the men don't have to carry the babies and don't have to bear the shame. But they bear the guilt. And everybody needs to hear that. This is a message that we need to get out. That morality is something not to be toyed with. It's a treasure from God. And so there are times when saying no is not any fun. There's times when saying no puts you at personal cost. And that's what Vashti did. So she said no. And he took the advice that he got and ousted the queen. And so now the kingdom is without a queen. So they decided they will seek a new queen. A Miss Persia contest, I would suppose it is. Well, who gets the throne but Esther? Now, you remember who Esther is. She's a slave. She's from Jerusalem. But this is Persia. That didn't seem to matter. She didn't flaunt her Jewish heritage. In fact, she didn't even tell anybody that she was Jewish. At Mordecai's advising. And we'll deal with who they are in just a little bit. She's a beautiful young woman. And she's an orphan. And she was raised by her cousin, her older cousin, Mordecai. They were both still living in Babylon. Now, this is after they had started to go back to Jerusalem. You remember last week? They had 2 or 3 influxes of Jews back to Jerusalem, but Mordecai and Esther and a lot of others stayed in Babylon. So she is in Babylon at this time. Mordecai was at the gate when he overheard 2 guys talking about killing the king. Mordecai told Queen Esther about it, and in turn, she told the king. Well, they investigated and found out it was true, so the king had the 2 conspirators or co-conspirators killed. in thinking about Mordecai, and there's a lot more to his story, but the message comes through that we need to be loyal and trustworthy, even when underhandedness might feel better. Even when underhandedness might feel better. Now you can imagine, Mordecai is a slave also. He's not just free to roam around and do whatever. And I pictured him before this reading of Esther that we did this week as, he's hanging around the palace so he could be next to Esther. But I don't really see that in this occasion particularly. He is sitting at the gate, and he probably has a job at the gate. He's probably a gatekeeper. And what he overhears is two guys planning to kill the king. Well, what does Mordecai do? He could sit back. He could say, well, he deserves it. He's getting what he deserves, what he really deserves. Because this king has taken us, from my homeland, and we're over here and we're working as slaves, and we should be back at home. And he could have had a bad attitude and been sour on the whole get-go. But he wasn't. He was a trustworthy person, and he was a loyal person. So he told the king about the two men that were planning to kill him. And they checked it out, and they decided that it was true. In Esther chapter 2, verse 21, it says, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. And that was during the time that Mordecai was sitting at the gate. I'm assuming he is a gatekeeper. But anyway, here's a Jew in Babylon. He hears two guys planning to murder the king. Then Haman comes on the scene. Haman is a guy that you love to hate. I mean, he really is a despicable person. He's wicked, he's sly. But he is named, after a series of events, second in command. And he has the king's ear. He was arrogant. He was cocky. And he's conniving. He's a slimy character. He's obnoxious. In other words, he's just like all the other politicians that we know. That's not really true. Xerxes had everyone in the whole kingdom to bow down to Haman. Xerxes had everyone in the kingdom to bow down to Haman. And they all did, except one person, Mordecai. He refused to pay Haman that honor. He refused to bow down before Haman. And that got under Haman's skin. It really got under Haman's skin. He was sidetracked by Mordecai. That bothered him a lot. That's typical. Out of all the positive comments we get, the one negative comment really sticks with us, and that's the one that bothers us so much. And that's the way Haman was too. Here's the way it's reported in one translation. In Esther 3, verse 5. When Haman saw for himself that Mordecai didn't bow down and kneel before him, he was outraged. Meanwhile, having learned that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman hated to waste his fury on just one Jew. He looked for a way to eliminate not just Mordecai, but all Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Well, he was racially prejudiced. He didn't like what Mordecai did, but he didn't like what everybody else, and I'm assuming all those that bowed down to him too, did because they were of Mordecai's race. So, Haman was a despicable character, and he displayed his despicable nature in that event. He was going to have all of them killed. Well, he couldn't just come to the king and say, I want to have all the Jews killed. So he had to, you can hear the wheels turning. And he came up with a plan. And that was the snook of the king. He snooked him into signing a decree that wound up annihilating all the Jews. He went to him and said, you got people in the land that really don't belong here, and they don't respect you, and they don't keep your laws. And so the king is thinking about that, and he says, well, who are they? And Haman says, well, I'll take care of it. In fact, I'll put money in the till to pay for their destruction. All I need is for the order. So Haman takes off his signet ring and gives it to, Xerxes takes off his signet ring and gives it to Haman. And that gives him total rights to do whatever he wants to do. And he writes the decree. What the king didn't realize was that the order would include his own wife, Queen Esther. I told you Haman was slick. And evidently Haman didn't realize it would include her either. She had not yet revealed her relationships. But Esther 3 verse 13 says, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children. On a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Bewildered. They didn't understand. These are his own expatriates. These are people from Babylon were bewildered by the edict because the Jews were good people, and the Jews were serving all the nations, in various ways. So, the people of Susa are going to lose all their service. And I'm assuming that most of the Jews acted towards their masters, if you want to call them that, like Mordecai did. But now he's going to annihilate them all. So they were even bewildered. Well, when the word reached out across the land, it reached the ears of Mordecai. And he was upset. In fact, he was more than upset. Esther chapter 4, verse 1 says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. So he wasn't keeping that to himself. The edict is out. Babylon is a large city, but Persia has 127 provinces. It had gone out to everybody. And so Mordecai sees the writing on the wall. It's over for the Jews. They're going to completely annihilate them. Now, the signet ring was important because you pass laws and you put your signet ring on it to sign it, and that became law. But it was the law of the Medes and Persians. That was a special law. That meant that the law couldn't be repealed. It couldn't be repealed. It couldn't be altered. Nothing about the law would change. That's the significance of the law of the Medes and Persians. Haman had it the way he wanted it. And now the Jews were gone. And Mordecai sat in sackcloth and ashes. You know what that is. It's a sack. It's a bag. And they wore sackcloth that would be the cheapest kind of attire that you could wear. And it would show your degradation, your mourning, your grieving. And he put ashes on his head, which was also a sign. And when Esther looked out of the palace one day and saw Mordecai acting that way, and wearing sackcloth and ashes, and weeping and wailing, she decided, I got to do something. So what did she do? She sent him some clothes and said, you need to straighten up and put your clothes back on. And Mordecai sent word back to her that it's more than clothes. It's something real serious. And he sends back these words. This is in Esther 4, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back his answer, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape." In other words, he says, you're on the list too. Verse 14, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this." You know, when God is not openly functioning, he's still functioning. When he's silent to us, he's not silent. God's name is not in the book of Esther at all. And for that reason, the book of Esther was considered to not make it into the Bible. But he is replete in every situation in Esther. And the faith of Mordecai and the faith of Esther shine forth like a brilliant light. So God is in the book of Esther, but he's not in the book of Esther. He is behind the scenes and working in everything that happens. And he knew that the way to get Xerxes to do something about this was for Queen Vashti to be there and to tell him. She didn't have a right to the throne. She wasn't supposed to be in the king's palace at all. She was supposed to be somebody's servant somewhere. But they put out the order to get all the girls together that were beautiful women, and they gave them a year's worth of beauty treatments, and they were having this great procession because Vashti had stood up and she was ousted. And now Esther is promoted above everybody else in the kingdom. And now she's the queen, and she has access to Xerxes. And Mordecai tells her, you need to go see Xerxes. But she didn't want to go. She says, look, I can't go to the king because, it's against the law. It really is against the law to go to the king uninvited. She says the only way you can avoid that is if you go in and he extends his scepter to you, then that means he accepts you. But she said, it's been 30 days since he's called me in there. She was afraid. She was fearful of her life. That's why she didn't want to go. But when Mordecai sent the word back to her, and she realized the seriousness of the situation, she changed her mind. And this is what she says in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will fast with you as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Man, we can read those words in just a second or two, but those words have meaning. They have impact. You think about Queen Esther's life. She went from slave to queen, just like that. And she's got everything that you could ever want to have. She's got more than any slave, more than any other Jew. But she's got more than everybody. If she wants it, she has it. And, we wouldn't want to mess that up, would we? If we're in her situation, we wouldn't want to mess that up. I've got a good job. I've got, family concerns. And there's so many things that we could go through to rationalize what she wound up going against. But sometimes Esther teaches us you have to risk it all. Sometimes you just have to risk it all. And so she called on Mordecai and the other Jews to fast for her and to pray for 3 days. Fasting and praying. Fasting and praying. Well, there are times in the Bible where fasts are called. There are times in the Bible where fasts are personal. And all of them are acceptable. There's not an instruction that we have to fast. But Jesus said, my disciples are not fasting now, but there's going to come a time when they will fast because I won't be here. And we need to indicate, or it's indicated to us rather, that we also need to incorporate fasting. I believe in fasting. Fasting in the Bible didn't normally include a 24-hour period. It didn't normally include 3 24-hour periods. Or you hear, Jesus fasted for 40 days. And there are various kinds of fasts in the Bible. There's only one fast that was required of people, and it was a 12-hour fast. Well, all of us just about it can do that with some medical restriction, I understand. But doing without food heightens our awareness. It heightens our intensity. And when we combine prayer and fasting, which I think is the Bible way, it's the Bible principle behind it, every time our bodies want to urge us to eat, if we'll stop and say a prayer, I'm remembering that because of this. I'm remembering the why I'm fasting. I'm remembering to pray because I have the physical need or the physical hunger. Most of us eat more than we need to anyway. And we eat by the clock instead of by our stomachs. We eat for a lot of reasons. But this is an occasion where she called on everybody to fast. And they did. They prayed day and night for her. And then she went in. She was willing to risk it all to accomplish God's purpose. In 1988, a photographer who was also a skydiver jumped out of his airplane to film the other skydivers as they were jumping and whatever they were doing. And when he decided that it was, had enough free fall and he needed to pull his ripcord, he reached to pull his ripcord and there wasn't a ripcord. He'd forgot his parachute. And he died while they were broadcasting his jump. Well, that's what faith is all about. Faith is jumping without a parachute. Faith is jumping without a parachute. Faith is when you come to the edge of the light and knowing that your next step will be in total darkness. Trusting God will either give us something firm to stand on or he'll teach us how to fly. That's faith. Esther didn't have anything to stand on. She risked it all. And I'm glad she did, aren't you? And when the king found out about it, well, the story of the banquets and all that is priceless. You'll have to read it. It's like I was in 8th grade giving a book report. You'll have to read the end of the story if you want to know how the book ends. But it's great. It's made for movies. It's a perfect ending. But she was taught how to fly because she stepped out in faith. And that's what we have to learn to do. We have to trust God. Trust God. Trust God. He's the way, and he's the only way. In conclusion, in Romans 15, verse 4, it says, for everything that was written in the past, and that was including the book of Esther when it was written, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the word of the scriptures, we might have hope. So we gain our hope when we get our messages from the Bible. And I want us all to be thinking about Esther and what I didn't cover everything that you could cover in this. But you get the ideas from the Scriptures, the endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, that we might have hope. May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you a spirit of unity among yourselves as you follow Christ Jesus, so that with one heart and mouth you may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is a good message. I don't know if it was delivered all right or not, but I want you to think about it. I want you to think about the people and think about the promises that God has made. And think about how they depended on the promises and nothing else. And that's what Esther was doing. That's what Mordecai was doing. And without the promises of God, it would have been a foolish mistake for her to step forward. But because of the promises of God, she was willing to risk it all. And she got what she had. She had material wealth, and she got to keep it. And then they were blessed by far beyond. So where are you? What is your faith level? What is my faith level? I mean, we're supposed to add to our faith knowledge and all those things in Peter. Are we adding to our faith day by day? Are we stronger now than we were a month ago or a year ago? If not, consider Esther. And come forward if you have anything you want to say.